The day I stepped into my in-laws' mansion, my daughter-in-law looked me up and down and said, cold as marble, "We think you should go home." My heart cinched tight. 64 years old, a lifelong widow, I, Evelyn Parker, had never felt so small or out of place. Decades of sacrifice, all those years raising my child in a cramped apartment, shrank to a punchline under a glittering chandelier. I knew exactly what I was in their eyes, a forgettable burden. But here's the thing. That very moment of humiliation became a turning point. I had no idea that Christmas Eve wouldn't just change how they saw me, it would change the future of a very prestigious family. I didn't go there to beg for pity. I went to prove this. When kindness is strong enough, it can smash any wall of prejudice. And sometimes, a single grease-smeared can of Coca-Cola can make a throne tremble. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, share this story, and don't forget to comment where you're listening from. Because you're about to hear my journey from the woman they tried to push out to the one who made an entire room of power go silent and listen. I stepped into the great hall awash in light and tinkling laughter over a wash of Christmas music. My daughter-in-law, Amanda Harrington, skimmed me from hem to hair, then exhaled slowly as if dusting an unwanted object. Her voice came thin and cold as ice. "We'd prefer if you left." I stood there and felt my heart drop like a wine glass slipping off a banquet table. A few heads turned. Their judgment skimmed over me like winter wind needling down a collar. My name is Evelyn Parker, 64, a widow living on a pension just big enough for rent, utilities, and groceries that stretch if I skip a meal. You might think I'm used to being ignored, but the silence in that room was different. It was the rehearsed kind, the polite consensus that I did not belong. I heard a spoon tap a rim at the head of the table and caught Patricia's eyes, Amanda's mother, slotting me into an invisible label, outsider. I wanted to turn on my heel right then, but before an answer fled my mouth, a memory flared like a candle fighting a gust. My son Daniel's phone call. "Mom, Amanda's family wants you at Christmas this year," he said, like reading a calendar reminder. "Actually, they want to meet you, really meet you." I sat in my threadbare wingback by the window, watching a pale stripe of sun fade on the floorboards. For 3 years, our visits had felt like prefix meals, greetings, safe questions, a courteous reminder that they were busy. That invitation felt like a ticket into a room I'd only peered at through the crack of a door. "That's good, honey," I said, keeping my voice even, but under that calm ran another current. "What changed?" He paused, then lowered his voice. "They want everything. Presentable. Family, partners, the whole thing. Amanda thinks it'll help if people see we're unified. Presentable. Unified." Pretty words drifting down like ribbons, and all I could hear was the clink of metal underneath. I'd taught Daniel the difference between real kindness and hollow manners. Now I had to remind myself of the same lesson. That night I opened my closet. The black dress from my husband's funeral, a faded blue shift, and the red outlet dress from last season. The sale tag still pinned. I lifted each one, weighing it on my arm like memories. "Don't let them remember you for the outfit," I told myself. "Let them remember the way you stand." The next morning I walked to the corner market. The clerk knows my name and asked after my old cat. I bought milk, a loaf of bread, and hesitated at the soda case. A red can of Coca-Cola gleamed under the light. I thought of summers ago when Frank, my husband, showed me how to clean car battery terminals with cola, said sometimes the simplest thing solves the fussiest problem. I smiled to myself, and kept my hand on the can. In the end, I dropped it in the basket, a trivial item, or maybe a memory I wanted to carry. I practiced my smile in the mirror. What do you enjoy about volunteering? Oh, helping people find their hands again, and a little self-respect. I practiced the right kind of silence, too. Used well, silence can be the gavel that lets someone hear their own off-key note. Daniel called twice that week. Mom, remember, they like light topics. Maybe skip money troubles. Sweetheart, I said with a tilted laugh. I've survived the Reagan storm, the Clinton squalls, the housing crash, and the gale of being looked at like last season's handbag. I can chat without choking anyone. I heard him exhale, that sigh braided from love and embarrassment. My boy was stuck between two shores, and I was the only bridge he had. The night before the party, I washed the red dress and hung it by the window to dry. Cold air blew in, smelling of coming snow. I wrote a line in my notebook. Their invitation isn't a gift. It's a test I never signed up to take. I closed the book and felt my chest loosen. Name a thing correctly, and fear shrinks. The morning of, the sky was a pot lid pressed over the city. I did my hair, coaxing the silver to lie down like taming a flock of birds. A touch of lipstick, not to make me younger, but to remind me my mouth still carried words that deserved to be heard. I slipped into the red dress, the heels that pinch, the worn, thick coat. Before I shut the door, I looked around my little apartment. Every object knows my name. Within these thin walls, I've never been tested. At the bus stop, an elderly couple bickered about directions. I met her eyes and smiled. She smiled back, a quiet woolen scarf of a smile. Out there, the world might demand a performance. Here among strangers, I was still a person. That was enough to step on with my spine intact. As the bus rolled over the bridge into the wealthy enclave, the sky turned to silver. I saw gated roofs curled with wrought iron, hedges trimmed like regiments at attention. Everything was rounded and sleek, as if life here never hit a pothole. But I know even the best paved road sags under snow. Text me when you arrive, Daniel wrote. I'll come get you. I sent a heart, the only emoji I saved for him. I don't know if it eased him any, but I wanted him to know I am still his mother, no matter what anyone else calls me. The Harrington gate slid open like the mouth of a big fish. The guard's eyes flicked to my tired shoes and back to professional blank. I drew a breath. I hadn't come to beg permission to exist. I'd come to stare down their mirror and see whether it reflected a person or just expensive masks. Inside, I caught waltz time under the scent of orange and clove. Chandeliers poured strands of light onto the floor. I spotted Daniel in the distance, my boy's eyes, an anchor. Then Amanda appeared and dropped that shard of ice. We'd prefer if you left. I didn't turn away. Maybe because I've turned away too many times in my life. I lifted my chin and smiled, with the calm I keep in the deepest drawer. Do you really think so, Amanda? I asked, no louder than a spoon on china. Conversation paused. Patricia set down her glass. I heard the wall clock tick, each beat a nail. In Amanda's pupils, I saw myself small as a pinprick of red on a vast rug. And then, somewhere inside me, a quiet laugh surfaced, because I suddenly understood. People who invite you to test you often forget they're being tested too. Daniel moved toward us. Mom, let me... I laid a hand on his arm, a light press. It's all right, I said. I'm here. And I didn't just mean the address. I meant a woman had stepped fully into her own life without asking permission. I smiled at a passing server and took a glass of water. Cool water, warm throat. I turned back to Amanda. If someone needs me to leave, I said, They'll need a better reason than the inconvenience of their gaze. A ripple ran the room like wind through manicured trees. Patricia smothered a tight smile. Daniel breathed out, and I stood steady. Days like this always have two halves, the one people expect, and the one that happens when someone dares to twist the doorknob. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Weather alert, an ice storm inbound, roads slick. I glanced at the screen and looked up. Outside, winter was laying down its cards. Inside, a different wind had just shifted. And I had no idea that within hours, a stranger on the shoulder of the road would speak Power's true name, and I would find my own voice in the sound of an engine catching back to life. I don't remember the first time Amanda called me cozy. Maybe it was at dinner the night she and Daniel announced their engagement. But the sharpest memory is the wedding. Me, Evelyn Parker, standing adrift in a sea of silk gowns and tuxedos fitted like second skins. I wore a blue dress gone a little threadbare, the same one I'd worn to Frank's funeral. I remember smoothing the hem in the mirror and telling myself, at least it fits. Walking into the Harrington garden, big as a public park, I felt like a sparrow dropped into a flock of peacocks. The peacocks held their heads high. Tails flared, and the rustle of their feathers wasn't for flying. It was to remind smaller creatures the sky wasn't for them. I clutched my cheap handbag the way you grip a rock in a storm. Patricia Harrington, Amanda's mother, met me at the gate. She was about my age, but every line in her face looked moisturized and paid for. Her smile was wax stiff, her eyes never quite landing on me, skimming instead like she was pricing an antique. "This is Daniel's mother from New Haven," she told a cluster of guests. Not my name, not a single story, just a place of origin, as if I were a wine they'd never heard of. Fine for dinner, not worth asking about. Richard Harrington was different, polished, measured, the kind of man who's comfortable at a podium. But when he shook my hand, I knew it wasn't meant to hold. Just a procedural tap, quick and cool, withdrawn as if contact might smudge. "A pleasure, Mrs. Parker," he said, the last syllable dropping like a stone. They sat me at the end of the table, the stretch where even the servers hardly bothered to pause. Talk swirled about stocks, European resorts, and private clubs I couldn't afford to tour, much less join. I smiled and nodded, pretending to follow. But inside all I heard was flatware and the hollow in my chest. Amanda sat beside Daniel in her white dress, all sleek grace. She turned to her friends, smiled that courteous, empty smile, and said, "Her apartment is very cozy." I knew what she meant. Cozy in her mouth didn't mean warm. It sounded like a polite way to say, damp sweater. I thought, not without humor, they'll never call me poor. They'll just call me cozy. And from Amanda, cozy lands worse than cheap. Daniel tried to soften it, changing the subject. "My mom's a great cook. Her Italian made my friends obsessed." Amanda flicked him a look, enough to say, "That's plenty." I watched my son shrink into a boy who thinks he's misbehaved, while I was the one absorbing the contempt. After the vows, I stood alone by a line of trees. A polite stranger asked if I thought the garden was beautiful. "It is," I said, "but I think these flowers only bloom for people who know how to look at them." He gave a short laugh and drifted back to his circle. Message received. My presence should graze the air and then disappear. Even in the family photo, I was pushed to the edge. The photographer asked me to step back for balance, and when the prince came, half my torso was lost behind leaves, as if the landscaping had conspired to erase me. But there's one moment I keep. Eleanor Harrington, the family matriarch, sat alone, eyes like polished ice. Cold, bright, alert. Unlike Patricia and Richard, she didn't paste. On a smile, she watched. When I passed, she tipped her head once. No words, just a nod that told me I wasn't completely invisible. From that day, I understood my place in this family. I was Daniel's shadow, allowed to follow, never to stand in the light. Amanda wanted a doctor husband and a glossy future, but felt dragged by the weight of a poor mother-in-law. To her, I was a reputation liability. I saw it each time she spoke to me in that courteous, hollow tone. The way you speak to a server you don't plan to learn the name of. Another dinner, she chirped. Daniel's mom is so down to earth. The table tittered, thinking it a compliment. I heard the real line, too ordinary to fly. I finished my water, swallowed the lump, and smiled like the words were sugar. I know those layers of politeness. They don't kill you outright. They shave you thin, day by day, until one morning you realize you've become a walking scar. What Amanda didn't expect was what her contempt taught me. I will never ask permission to exist in my son's life. If they build walls, I'll learn to climb. If they build doors, I'll learn to knock. And if they throw me out, I'll memorize the spot, so one day I can walk back in through the front, upright, without bowing my head. Because even a sparrow, cornered, can beat its wings hard enough to make the peacocks look up, and I, Evelyn Parker, still have my wings. I had no idea that day, me, lost in the dazzle of their perfect wedding, was only the prelude. Another Christmas would come, and I'd step into their world again. But next time, I wouldn't be the trembling sparrow. I'd be the gust that knocks the peacocks off balance. The morning before the party, I pulled up the blinds and found a sky the color of a heavy wool blanket pressed over the city. Not a shaft of sun, just wind scraping along rooftops thin as tin. I told myself, if I'm going to step onto their stage, I'd better choose something that makes them look me in the eye before they look away. I started where my wallet could breathe, the outlet on the edge of town. Racks crowded like a thicket, red sale tags perched on the branches like butterflies. I sifted piece by piece, feeling each weave, imagining how it would look under the Harrington chandeliers. A deep red dress caught my eye. Not fancy, but the fabric knew how to keep quiet. I held it to my body and felt like a rose in an ordinary vase. Not dazzling, but it knew how to stand where it belonged. Shoes were another negotiation. I picked nude heels with a slim stiletto, the kind of line that sounds half compliment, half critique. I walked a few steps on the tile. Every step reminded me beauty charges a fee. My feet hurt, and I pictured Amanda's glance skimming the hems of other women's dresses. I clicked my tongue. Some battles call for a shoe that floats a little above the ground. At the register, the clerk stared a moment, not judging, more like measuring a life she didn't know. I smiled. She whispered, "Good luck," and blushed. I nodded, wondering why those two words sounded more like goodbye than blessing. That afternoon, I stopped at the alterations shop downstairs so the seamstress could take in the waist. She looped the soft tape around me and asked what the occasion was. "A family party," I said. She smiled, pins winking like tiny silver fish. "Family," she said, "is a competition no one admits is a competition." I laughed. Maybe we're afraid to see a scoreboard where we're not in first place. Back home, I hung the dress on the closet door and let it drink the light for a few hours the way a person drinks a glass of water. I laid out my makeup, cheap, old, but familiar in my hands. The mirror threw back a 64-year-old woman bargaining with herself. I practiced the smile for questions I already knew by heart. "Your son's wedding was beautiful. Your daughter-in-law is so lovely. Where do you live? Nod, nod, add listening eyes. I practice changing the subject too, building a small bridge that carries people off the cliff edge of their curiosity. A knock startled me. Mrs. Lopez poked her head in, bringing the smell of roasted corn and a bright crackle of laughter. She's Mexican, hands that tell stories. She held out a warm box of tamales. Eat, she said. Women heading into battle need something in their stomachs. Steam rose when I opened it. The scent of masa tugged up memories of a poor kitchen that was somehow always warm. She whistled softly at the dress on the door. Beautiful. I told her lightly about the party, the looks I'd collected, the pretty words, unity, family, that can hide a trap. She narrowed her eyes, listened. Then her hand settled on my shoulder and she dropped a sentence on the table like a key. Just be yourself, I smiled, but the water rippled inside. Being myself hasn't worked for 3 years, I said. Maybe tonight I'll try being their version of me. Mrs. Lopez shook her head and laughed. They can define their dream, she said, but don't ever lend them your voice to tell it. I held that advice the way you hold a hot teacup. It's so simple you could mistake it for useless, until night falls and you realize how warm it keeps you. When she left, the apartment went quiet again. I turned back to the mirror. I pinned each section of hair, brushed on a little foundation to fade the fatigue, drew a thin line at my lashes like writing a note to myself. I practiced the voice, low, steady. I repeated one sentence until it settled into my bones. I'm here, without asking permission. My phone buzzed. Daniel. Mom, I'll meet you at the gate tomorrow. Everything needs to be smooth. I stared at the word smooth, like it was a river glazed with ice. I typed back, I'll be on time, and I'll smile. Don't worry. I packed the small clutch, tissues, mints, a comb, a bus ticket folded like a paper charm. I looked around the apartment where every object knows my name. The chair creaked a little as I stood, as if wishing me safe travels. Clouds were bunching at the window's edge. I guessed there'd be snow. Winter always keeps its appointments, invited or not. Late, hunting for my kettle, I spotted the extra can of Coca-Cola from last week's groceries. I flipped it in my hand and thought of Frank and his trick for scrubbing battery terminals with soda. An odd image flashed, an icy road, a stalled car, my hands and a stranger's. I laughed at myself, then slipped the can into my bag like a cheap good luck charm. Who knows? I might need a reminder that beyond champagne and crystal, there are still simple fixes in this world. I sat and opened my nicked notebook. I wrote 3 lines. Dignity doesn't come from what other people call you. It comes from what you call yourself when you're alone. And tomorrow night, I'm going to say my name right. When I put the pen down, my heartbeat wasn't pounding anymore. I turned off the light and let the red dress breathe the dark, like an athlete resting before the meet. Morning. I pressed the dress, polished the shoes to blunt some of their meanness. I finished the tamales, drank warm water. In the mirror, I practiced straightening my back. It's carried enough sorrow. Now it needs to be straight enough to carry their gaze. I murmured a silent spell. I'm not going to ask for pity. I'm going to show them what kindness looks like. Before I left, I touched Frank's photo. He smiles in the old print, eyes patient. Don't worry, I told him. I know the way, even if it's iced over. I switched off the lamp, locked the door, lifted a bag light as air and heavy as resolve. On the stoop, cold air slipping down my collar. I heard myself whisper one last promise. This is my last chance to be recognized, not by the Harringtons, but by the woman standing in these painful shoes. I didn't know the most important item on my checklist wasn't in my clutch at all. It lived in one of Frank's old habits, a can of soda, and a stubborn faith that solutions can come from places no one expects. The next day, when the road really did turn to glass in front of me, I finally understood why I'd tucked that Coca-Cola into my bag. The road to the Harrington estate already twisted like a snake. Now it was sheeted in ice. Wind slapped the windshield and chunks of snow shattered like someone hurling buckets of flour at the ground. I gripped the wheel, eyes straining at the dim smears of headlights ahead. The Harringtons' Christmas Eve didn't wait for anyone, and here I was driving straight into a storm no one would advise. My hands were shaking. Cold or nerves, I couldn't tell. I'd spent a week preparing to walk into that mansion looking put together, but this road seemed determined to remind me that plans don't mean much in the face of a gust of wind. The red dress was tucked under a heavy coat. The heels, worth more than a month of groceries, were sealed in a bag so they wouldn't get dirty before I ever got to show them off. At the last bend, my headlights washed over a scene that made me slam the brakes. A luxury car sat skewed onto the shoulder, hood flung open, white steam blowing into the knife-cold air. Beside it, an older woman stood hunched in an expensive fur, silver hair dusted with snow. I could have kept going. I was already 15 minutes late. Part of me wanted to hit the gas and tell myself Ain't de Paupier was one phone call away. But then Frank's voice came back, the way it always does. Evelyn, don't ever leave someone on the side of the road. One day it'll be you or me standing there. I braked hard, rolled down the window, and let the wind hit me in the face. Do you need a hand? I shouted over the gale. She turned, angular features, bright, tired eyes. Not panicked, just a long, steady exhale. My car died. I think it's the battery. I nodded. Let me take a look. I climbed out, flats drinking in the cold, popped the hood, and leaned over. Just like Frank taught me in that little garage years ago, the posts were crusted white, like salt. Corrosion, I muttered. I glanced over and, do you have any Coca-Cola? Her brows knit, surprised, as if I'd asked to borrow a diamond ring for a lighter. Then she reached into a glossy leather bag and produced a small can of Coke. I smiled. Perfect. I cracked it and poured the fizz over the terminals. A soft hiss, the steam thinning. I used my car key to scrape away the chalky buildup. My fingers went numb, but I kept at it. Frank used to say, "Don't be afraid to get dirty, Evelyn. Hands wash. Leaving someone behind doesn't." She watched quietly, tugging her coat tight. "You're going to ruin your dress," she said. I shrugged. Better my dress than a person in a storm. A few minutes later, I dropped the hood. Try it now. She slid behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine coughed, then settled into an even hum, the sound of a heart deciding to beat again. She smiled for the first time. Not many people stop in weather like this. Thank you. I wiped my sticky hands with a tissue. Just doing what Frank taught me. Frank? My husband. He passed 5 years ago. He believes simple fixes can save complicated situations. She nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting. He was right. I hesitated. I'm on my way to a party. My son. His in-laws are wealthy. I'm afraid they won't love this look. I gestured at the damp coat, the matted hair, the hem smudged with road grime. She raised an eyebrow. If someone can't recognize the value of a kind act, their party isn't worth attending. I let out a dry laugh. I spent a week prepping to make an impression. Turns out the first impression was made with a $2 Coke. She reached into her pocket and handed me an ivory card with raised ink. I read the name, Eleanor Harrington. I went still. Harrington. The same grandmother Amanda mentions in that flat little voice. She's old. She just sits while my father runs the company. She doesn't care about business. And here she was, in the blizzard, the matriarch herself. Eleanor held my gaze, a quiet, deep smile. Evelyn Parker, isn't it? I've been wanting to meet you. Seems fate picked a storm to make the introduction. Wind sliced my cheeks, but something warm lit up inside me. I wasn't the stray guest on their threshold anymore. I just jump-started the Queen's car. I followed her through the gates, my heart still rattling. I'd spent a week worrying about making the right impression. But when I walked into that party, I wouldn't be entering from the cold by myself. I'd be walking in with Eleanor Harrington, and every pair of eyes in that room would see me differently. The Harrington mansion door swung open and a wave of heat, cinnamon, orange, and wine rolled out like a curtain. But I, Evelyn Parker, stepped in looking like I'd just crawled out of a snowstorm. The red dress I'd pampered all week was streaked with grime. My hair was a wet snarl pasted to my cheeks. The heels I'd bought with a month of grocery money were waterlogged and heavy. Each step left a muddy print on the mirror-bright marble. Conversation sagged in the great hall. Heads turned. They looked at me the way you look at a soaked sparrow that's flown into a peacock pen. Amanda spoke first. Of course she did. She slid out from the crowd in a silver-white silk dress, lips lacquered the color of ice, eyes narrowed. "Oh dear, what happened to you?" I forced a smile, opened my mouth, but Patricia got there first, her voice as sharp as a cake knife. "Evelyn, how unexpected." Unexpected fell from her lips like a verdict. Not a pleasant surprise, an unwelcome crack in an expensive vase. By the fireplace, Richard Harrington adjusted his scarf, let his gaze brush me, just long enough to register displeasure, then turned to murmur to another guest. Daniel pushed through from the back, worry lighting his face. "Mom, are you okay? You look like you've been in an accident." I started to answer, but Amanda dusted sugar over a sour rim. "Maybe you should change before you meet everyone. We have a guest suite, farther away." I drew a breath. This was exactly the nightmare. Show up looking wrecked and become the evening's punchline. If I'd come alone, maybe I would have turned around. But I hadn't walked in alone. A measured click of heels on stone. Eleanor Harrington, the woman I'd just helped on an iced-over road, moved into the hall. She didn't raise her voice. One lifted hand, one level look, and the room obeyed. People say Eleanor's old, that she ceded everything to Richard. I understood at once. Women like this never really leave the stage. "Before anyone rushes to judge," she said, her voice carrying cleanly under the chandelier, "listen to what Evelyn did on her way here." I went still. She was pulling me into the light at the very moment I wanted to disappear. She told it simply, each sentence set down like a paperweight in the air. The blizzard, the dead luxury car, the stranger who stopped. She lingered on the part where I knelt in the storm and cleaned the battery posts with a can of Coca-Cola, ignoring dress, hair, and shoes. A ripple moved through the guests who'd just been sizing me up. I caught a few eyes sparking with curiosity. A pearl-strung woman whispered, "Resourceful, isn't she?" A man in a window-pane suit nodded. "Who knew Coke could do that?" Amanda's expression shifted. She tried to smile, but her lips tightened like they'd been tied with string. "Grandmother, it was a small thing. I'm sure Evelyn would like to change before—" Eleanor cut in, quiet but heavy. "A small thing? Let me ask again. How many people in this room would stop in a blizzard to help a stranger, no matter what their dress cost? Silence. Faces accustomed to fixing problems with money or a phone avoided her eyes. Richard frowned. Mother, perhaps we don't need to make a roadside incident the focus of the evening. Eleanor turned to him, smiling a thread-thin smile. Exactly, Richard. Roadside. The place we forget exists while we raise our glasses in rooms like this. I stood there dripping, dress clammy against my skin. But for the first time since I'd walked in, I didn't feel ashamed. In Eleanor's voice was something I'd wanted for 3 years. Recognition. Amanda noticed the attention had pivoted away from her and onto me. She bit her lip and pinned on a smile that looked like a crack in fresh paint. Patricia straightened, glass cold as ever, irritation leaking through her eyes. Eleanor stepped forward, fingers resting on a chair's carved arm, and said clear enough to ring off the crystal. That kind of kindness is the foundation of this family's fortune. The words landed like a bronze bell, humming through the room. I heard a soft gasp, a spoon tap a saucer, and the thud of my own heart. So there I stood, soaked shoes, wrinkled dress, lit by a chandelier I'd never expected to stand under. And I knew, from this moment on, the Harringtons would have to relearn where power actually begins, starting with me. Dinner that night was served in a room big enough to swallow my entire apartment building. The ceiling soared. Crystal chandeliers poured light over a long table draped in white. Silverware aligned like soldiers at attention. I was about to slip toward my usual place at the far end, when Eleanor laid a light hand on my elbow. "Sit beside me, Evelyn," she said, not loudly but with enough gravity that a server instantly drew out the chair at her right. I froze. Me, a dripping-haired woman in a soiled dress, invited to sit next to the hostess, in the seat reserved for the most important guest. I heard a small, prim throat clear from Patricia and caught Amanda's razor glance. But I sat, back straight, as if that chair had been waiting for me all along. All through the meal, Eleanor asked the kinds of questions no one else ever had. She wanted to know what Frank, my husband, had done for a living. I told her he was a carpenter, hands always rough, turning raw wood into sturdy tables and chairs. She listened, nodding. A person who leaves behind things that serve daily life, that's a legacy worth admiring, she said softly. On my other side, a retired ambassador leaned in to ask about the free trade classes Frank used to run for kids in our neighborhood. For the first time at a Harrington table, I felt people listening to me not out of etiquette, but because they actually cared. Across the table, Amanda managed a brittle smile, tossing in the occasional dry remark, but the current of attention wasn't running her way. Richard's face tightened by the minute. He clamped his glass as if it could keep him from losing control. After dinner, we were invited to the library for coffee and brandy. The room was a little kingdom, dark wood ceiling, bookcases to the rafters, oil portraits of ancestors hanging in pomp. Firelight leapt in the hearth, washing faces gold. I was about to pick a far corner chair when Eleanor signaled me again. She took the wingback by the fire. I sat to her right. Richard and Amanda took the left. Tension hummed through the room like an overtuned string about to snap. "Mother," Richard began, voice carefully calm. "Perhaps company matters can wait until tomorrow. It's Christmas. People want to enjoy themselves." Eleanor turned, the blue of her eyes bright in the flames. "Enjoy? Difficult when I've read this quarter's reports. Profits are high, but the foundation? Hollow." I watched the color shift in his face. Amanda touched her father's hand, but Eleanor's gaze moved to me. "Evelyn, do Do you know why people talk about the Harrington legacy? I shook my head, cautious. She rose and walked to the great painting on the wall, a man in an old-fashioned suit, stern gaze, introduced to all as Harold Harrington, the founder. Eleanor touched the frame, then turned back, her voice even and sharp as a blade. The man in that portrait is not the founder, I am. The room went stone silent. Only the crackle of the fire spoke. Richard lurched to his feet. Mother, don't. We all know Father built the... No, Eleanor cut in. Your father was a good high school teacher. He supported me, but I took the first loan, signed the first contract, built the first plant. I worked 18 hours a day to lay the foundation. Harold stood beside me because society accepted it more easily that way. But the soul and backbone of this company are mine. Amanda paled. Grandmother, why say this now? Everyone always believed. Yes, believed. Because they needed a male face to feel comfortable. I stayed quiet because silence was convenient for the family. But tonight I need to tell the truth. Because Evelyn, she turned to me. What happened on that icy road reminded me of myself when I was young. A woman who could improvise, who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, who chose what was right over what was easy. I sat stunned. While I'd been treated like the outsider, the person truly erased from the story was the woman beside me. I looked up at Harold's painted eyes, stern and empty, and understood why Eleanor still stood so tall. She'd carried a company on her back, only to have her name rubbed out. Richard cleared his throat, blushing. Mother, this isn't the time to... Eleanor lifted a hand, cutting him off again. Richard, you and Amanda have turned this company into a cold money printer. It wasn't built on greed. It was built on endurance and on community values. Tonight isn't just about the past, it's about the future. The air thickened. A few guests murmured. Surprise flickered openly in their faces. Amanda forced a smile, knuckles whitening around her glass. And there I was, in that glittering library, feeling the world tilt. The one pushed from the center was the true heart of the line. And I, the woman kept at the margins, had been moved to the closest seat to witness it. I hadn't yet caught my breath when Eleanor turned back, eyes bright as flame. Evelyn, she said, from now on, I need you at my side. The room fell silent again. I understood. The night wasn't over. It had only just begun. The air in the library was thick as fog. The fire snapped and hissed, and I swear even the sparks held their breath for what was about to happen. Eleanor sat straight-backed in her wing chair, an aging queen still made of iron, eyes boring into Richard and Amanda. What have you turned Harrington Industries into? She asked, not loudly but with a blade's edge that made everyone flinch. A money machine, cold, soulless, a company once built with hands and human principles, now a monster that only eats profit. Richard swallowed, smoothing his tone. Mother, we've posted record earnings. Investors are pleased. That's what matters. Eleanor's mouth curved in a dry smile. Matters. When employees complain about wages, when community funds are cut, when our name is dragged through the mud. Richard, you're building a castle on sand, and sand is never loyal. Amanda jumped in, eyes flashing. Grandmother, you're letting an outsider like Evelyn cloud your judgment. She doesn't belong in this world. A ripple of whispers. A few guests stifled laughs at her rudeness. I wanted to melt back behind the wall of books, but Eleanor lifted a hand and pointed straight at me. An outsider? Evelyn is living proof of what this family forgot. In a blizzard, she stopped to help a stranger. No thought for herself, no fear of a ruined dress or tangled hair. She did the right thing when no one asked her to. All eyes swung to me. My heart pounded like a drum, but this time it wasn't shame. For once, the very ordinary they sneered at had become evidence of courage. Richard gave a brittle laugh. Mother, a spur-of-the-moment roadside gesture doesn't set the course for a corporation. Eleanor rose. She's small, but her shadow swallowed both Richard and Amanda on the paneled wall. Not a gesture, Richard, a nature. Evelyn did what you've forgotten. She put people before profit. I opened my mouth to protest. I hadn't meant anything grand. I was just doing what Frank taught me. But Eleanor lifted her palm to stop me. She looked me in the eye, then declared in a voice that shook the room. Effective immediately, I am appointing Evelyn Parker as community advisor to Harrington Industries. She will work with me to oversee our social responsibility projects and reconnect this company with the communities that raised us. And her compensation, her gaze swept the room, will match the value she brings. The room erupted. Sharp breaths, a spoon clattering, a flurry of whispers. Patricia's hand flew to her chest, shock uncloaked. Amanda's mouth fell open as if she'd been slapped by air. Richard went red, lips trembling, but he didn't dare interrupt his mother. And me, Evelyn, I could barely breathe. An hour ago, I'd been gently urged to leave before I embarrassed anyone. Now they couldn't restart without me. I wanted to laugh, but my throat closed. One sentence tolled in my head like a bell. An hour ago, they wanted me gone. Now they can't begin again without me. I sat there with Coke still on my hands, a wrinkled red dress, shoes soaked through. Yet in the leap of the firelight, I realized I wasn't the outsider anymore. The room, the Harrington family, had to turn toward me. Eleanor looked back at Richard. Son, this isn't to humiliate you. It's a chance to make it right. You'll thank me when Harrington Industries is not just a name again, but a legacy. Richard clenched his jaw, silent. Amanda turned away, eyes blazing. I sat quietly, my thoughts a tangle of thread, and somewhere underneath, a thin blade of light. Recognition. A chance to do something that matters. I'd never believed I had a place here. But now Eleanor, the woman written out of her own history, had chosen me, the one written off as excess, to help write the next chapter. As the room settled, I understood something new. In this house, the power seats aren't awarded to the prettiest sitter. They're given to the one who keeps standing in a storm. And I knew the real storm was still waiting outside. The library was pin-drop silent, save for the crack of logs in the fireplace, when I nodded and accepted Eleanor's offer. I spoke slowly, so Richard, Amanda, and every guest lounging in those leather chairs would hear every word. I accept, not for the money, but because for the first time, I feel my real worth is being seen. My words hit the wood floor like small stones, tidy, but enough to shake the room. A few guests forced weak smiles. A couple others dipped their chins in approval. Richard clenched his jaw, staring into his brandy as if he meant to crush the glass in his fist. Amanda shot out of her chair, heels cracking against the floor, face flush scarlet. Grandmother, this is insane. She isn't one of us. She has no experience. She doesn't... Eleanor cut in, her voice gentle and hammer hard. Amanda, if experience just means knowing how to count money, the world is overflowing with it. I want someone who remembers people. Amanda bit her lip and looked to Richard, begging him to say what she couldn't. But Richard only sighed and gave a rigid nod, like a man dragged into a chess game with no pieces left to move. Patricia sat frozen, her face stony as a garden statue, her eyes skimming past me without feeling, as if she was trying to erase me from the scene altogether. And then Daniel, my son, looked at me. For the first time in years, his eyes weren't apologetic or tense. not the look of a boy afraid his mother might embarrass him. They were bright, shining, like he'd just discovered something new, that his mother wasn't a woman to be excused, but a woman who deserved to stand tall. "Mom," he whispered, voice shaking, "I'm proud of you." Hearing that, every scar from every slight and snub softened at once. I touched his hand, the same hand that used to be tiny in mine, now strong and trembling with feeling. I thought, my son finally sees me as I am. Amanda couldn't stand it. She spun on her heel, the silver dress hissing with anger, and disappeared through the door. Patricia lifted her glass but never drank, still staring into the flames. Richard, after a brief private battle, dipped his head once. Not to me, more a bitter surrender that he couldn't beat his mother. Or me. I sat a while longer listening as Eleanor spoke about next steps, but my mind drifted beyond the window. Outside, the garden lay under a clean sheet of snow. I suddenly needed air. I took a flute of champagne and stepped onto the stone terrace. The cold rushed me, and somehow I felt warmer. Strings of lights glittered on the pines, reflected in the thin crust of ice at my feet. I stood there, looked up at the pale gray sky, and smiled. "They sip $1 million vintages," I murmured, a little wry. "And me? I needed one greasy Coca-Cola to change my fate." The champagne in my hand flared like a small flame. I took a sip. The bitter edge faded on my tongue, and another sweetness rose in me, the sweetness of being recognized, of having my true value lit after years in the dim. I thought back to that frozen roadside, thinking I was doing some small, invisible thing. But that small thing turned out to be the key that opened a door I thought would stay locked forever. I glanced at the glowing house behind me and thought of Eleanor, the woman erased from her own family's history. She and I, the two who'd been treated as excess, were now standing at the very center of the story. Not a story about power or money alone, but about holding to what's right when everyone says it doesn't count. Daniel came out, bundled in a thick coat, and stood beside me. "Mom, are you sure about this job?" he asked, worry still clinging to his voice. I looked at my son and smiled. "Honey, I've tried pleasing them for years and got nowhere. Now I'm just going to do what I believe is right. That's it." He nodded, eyes still bright. I knew the invisible distance between us would start to dissolve. I raised my glass toward the warm gold inside. One question rang in my head, the one I want to leave with anyone hearing this. Do you think a single act of kindness can turn your whole life around? Believe me, it can. And that's how a Coke can, sticky with grease, became a new crown on my head. But if you think the story ends here, wait and see what happens when kindness collides with the fury of people terrified of losing their power. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.